What is going on, everyone? Welcome to another very exciting episode right here on the MIgardener channel. I am so excited for today's episode because we're going to be finally starting some seeds. After about 4 months of not having anything going on as far as like hands in the dirt, growing plants content, I'm really excited about it. I am so excited about this because it's the start of this year's garden. It's the start of the 2021 garden, and I know all of you guys are itching to get your garden started, or if you're in a warm climate, you already are getting your garden started, and for that, I am very jealous, but I'm also happy for you as well. Don't forget that. I'm jealous but happy. I can have both emotions. I just learned how to balance those emotions. So I'm having a great day. I hope you guys are as well. And we're also going to be doing something that I've really wanted to do for quite a while, and that is cover some seed starting mistakes. I know that a lot of you that are in warmer climates are already getting ready to start your seeds. So many of you have posted on the MIgardener, MIgardener Garden Forum on Facebook, and you're starting to send in your emails and you're posting on Instagram, and you're getting your seeds started already. And I've seen so many of these mistakes already popping up that I said, you know what? Even though I only have a small handful of seeds to start, about a flat's worth to start, I want to get this video out early so that I can catch all those people that might be making these mistakes and hopefully mitigate the issue. Because seed starting or making mistakes when seed starting is not the end of the world. It's not going to be, you're not doomed. The garden's not failed, but it can be a serious setback that can cost people money and time that you might not have. And so I really want to get this out, and I think that's hopefully going to be the objective, at least. And so what I want to do is I want to go through first the seeds that we're starting, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the soil mixture, and then we'll kind of get started and talk about some mistakes. There's a variety of different things that we are going to be starting. Not everything we're going to be putting in our garden this year. For instance, we have piccolino basil. That's not going into our garden. That's going into our windowsill herb garden. We also have some friends that wanted some seedlings as well, so I told them I'd start some seedlings. We have some zinnias for Mrs. MIgardener. She really wants to get into flower gardening this year, and with the new greenhouse project that we have going on, she wants to have a cut flower patch. So I'm going to start her some zinnias because she really loves zinnias. She got some of those, some poppies, some thyme. Thyme is a really great herb. We use a lot of it in our cooking. Some Italian large leaf basil. Again, these are, the thyme is going to go into our garden. The basil, there's so much time to grow basil. That's going to go in our friend's windowsill herb garden. They have a small apartment, and they were saying that they don't really feel confident in starting seeds. So I told them I'd start some seeds for them, and then after this time, I want them to start the seeds. So I'm going to give them a seedling for them to put in their windowsill herb garden, and then after that, it's on them to start the seeds. So some celery, some stevia, and some more pink celery. Now, I don't recommend using a permanent marker. A permanent marker is not the best thing to use. What I prefer to use is it's a UV resistant marker. And we do have some for sale over at MIgardener.com. It's just, mine was dried out. I left the cap off, and after about a year of not starting any seeds, a year will do it for you. Yeah, a year is enough to dry out a marker bone dry. So when I went to use it, it was bone dry. So I got a Sharpie for now, but I'll follow up with a UV resistant marker later. And that way they just don't fade, because that is the first mistake as we get into seed starting that I see a lot of you guys making, is using things like pencil, chalk, or Sharpie, or even pen to write your labels. And then after after you water, or it gets rained on, or it sits out in the sun all the time, they fade and you don't know what you planted. And you might even just directly sow seed in the ground, and you don't even know where your seeds are started. You have no idea, because there's no indication of what you planted, and and how much you planted, anything like that. So always make sure you go with a nice quality UV resistant marker, especially if you're planting outside and you want your labels to stay around for a long time. The second mistake that I see a lot of gardeners making is not compacting their seed starting mix. This is a new one that a lot of you guys haven't heard before. I know I've mentioned it, but I've never actually specifically pointed it out. And this is the first time that I'm actually going to mention this. You want to actually compact very slightly, not aggressively, but slightly, your seed starting mix. It's very important, especially if you're using a sifted mix like we are. That sifted mix has a tendency to be very fluffy. And you want to make sure that you pack enough soil in there so that as you water and as the plants grow, they have enough growing medium. It's like brown sugar. You know, when you're baking, they say pack brown sugar. Well, why? That's because brown sugar has a lot of air in between, and you pack it down so that you know how much you have. It's exactly the same analogy with your seed starting mix. You want to make sure that you have enough seed starting mix to really fill those cells up and last the time that your plants are going to be in those cells. And so as you water, if you notice that the amount of soil is decreasing very quickly, that's because you didn't pack it down enough. And so by giving it just a little press down, it's going to make sure that that is nice and settled in there. Now the third mistake I see people making so frequently with seed starting is that they don't pre-moisten their mix. Pre-moistening your mix is probably one of the more important things that you can do when seed starting, or when starting to start seeds. And that's because when you pre-moisten your mix, it actually will, it'll ensure that there's no, like dry pockets. You'll find that when your seed starting mix, or any soil for that matter, is super dry, it actually has a tendency to repel water. It's very water repellent, and that seems weird because you think that water would just absorb right in. But very, very dry soil will actually repel water. And what it can do is, if you don't pre-moisten your mix and you put your seeds, all neatly there, and you go to water, what can happen is the water can actually lift all the soil up. Everything starts floating and working, and you can tell right away that's not going to be a good thing, because it's very important that you know how deeply your seeds were planted. It's very important that you know where your seeds were planted. And it's very important that that stuff doesn't get all displaced, because that messes up the whole thing. You want, when starting seeds indoors, especially seeds indoors, you want to know, just in terms of consistency, where your seeds are at, and you want them all kind of the same. Now, the fourth mistake I see people making is planting your seeds too deep. If you plant your seeds too deep, it can happen if your seeds, float around in dry mix that gets watered, but it can also just happen by planting your seeds too deep. Seeds do not have to be planted very deep. In fact, I see people planting seeds like, buried treasure, and you don't want people to find the buried treasure. The thing is that when you're planting your seeds, you want them to be able to sprout and immediately be able to take up light, whether that's through a windowsill or a grow light. You need them to be able to take up the light. That's how they grow. If you plant them too deep, they're going to spend a lot of that energy actually pushing through the soil. And what you're going to find is your seedlings are going to be very stressed and laggy. So if you don't want to have stressed and laggy seedlings, laggy means they're stretching. And so if you don't want really laggy seedlings, it's important that you don't plant your seeds too very deep. Now the next mistake I see people making, I don't know, what are we on, 5? I think it's 5. The next mistake I see people making are starting the seeds too early. Now, as I said, I have a reason to be starting my seeds this early, because I have seeds that have a long maturity time, or I have seeds that I'm going to be giving to friends and family, and they're going to be growing them out to full maturity in their windowsill. But if you have too much time until you're planting outside, and you start your seeds too early, like if we were to plant, for instance, as much as I want to plant tomatoes, if we were to plant tomatoes right now, one of the biggest mistakes that I see are people getting just overzealous in planting their seeds like that, tomatoes, peppers, whatnot. And we have a good 60 to 65 days before we can plant outside. And the issue is that if you plant your seeds right now with 65 days till you're planting outside, a short maturity date tomato has something like 65 to 75 days to maturity. That means your tomato plant in 65 days is going to be up and fruiting. And where are you going to put it? The thing is going to be 1.5 feet, 2 feet tall. There's not enough space. There's not enough soil. You need bigger pots. You need a lot more water. It's just going to be super stressed. It's going to be very top heavy. It's going to be very difficult to transplant. You're going to transplant it. It's going to go through transplant shock. You possibly could break the stems. It's a big, big mistake. And so you need to realize that what you don't want to do is you don't want to start your seeds too early. If you look on the back of every seed packet, they should say, I can speak for MIgardener seeds because I know that this is super important information. It has the days to germination and the days to maturity. And it'll also tell you if it needs to be started directly outside or if you should start it inside so many weeks early. All right, clean hands and we're ready to plant. So I've just been taking the end of this Sharpie here and just poking a very small hole into each cell so that it can accept the seeds. Once we get our seeds planted, it's time to water. And that leads me to the next mistake I see way too many gardeners making, and that is direct watering with a watering can. Now this is not a habit that I want you guys getting into, and that's because watering cans are really not good indoors. They're not even good for things like houseplants. Now people will use them for houseplants, but I don't prefer you make a habit of it, and that's because direct watering indoors can have a whole host of problems. The first one with seed starting is, obviously, we're not talking about houseplants, we're talking about seed starting. So the first one is that when you water with a watering can, depending on the type of head that's on the watering can or the spout, it can be very direct and very abrupt. And what it can do is it can actually wash seeds around. And you might have a seed that hops over a cell, you might have a seed that gets buried deeper than it should. It just really disrupts a lot. And it's very jarring to seeds that have not actually been established. So what I prefer you to do is to use a holeless seed tray. Now a holeless seed tray is, as the name implies, without holes. It's holeless. And most seed starting trays, flats, will have a hole in the bottom to allow water to drain through. So what I do is I simply take that tray. That tray is very rigid, holds my stuff in place, holds my seed starting cells, and I'll simply set that inside of the holeless seed tray. And then what I do is I take my watering can and I water underneath. It's called bottom watering. And it's so much better because the plants actually absorb what they need rather than you just drowning them out over top like this and making a giant mess. They absorb what they need after they've soaked up there, and you can see that the soil is evenly moist. You can take them out, dump out the remaining water in the bottom tray, and you can go about your day. Another reason why I don't want you to get into a habit of watering with a watering can is because watering foliage can spread disease. And indoors where there's not really good airflow, there's not the natural ecosystems to kind of keep things in check, things like disease can run rampant. Now, the next mistake, and one of the final mistakes I see people making, is when they're seed starting, they seed start stuff that is not the same size when it's growing. This is a huge issue because the lights are overhead. The sun moves, right? The sun moves, and so where a shadow might be cast, there might be some sun later in the day, there's some forgiveness. Also, the sun is very strong and grow lights are not nearly as strong as the sun is. So if I were to take like this celery, which is a very small seed and a very small seedling once it germinates, and plant it next to a big plant like, say, the basil, what can happen is as the basil grows, the basil actually will shade out the celery. And indoors, that can be a big issue because you can't get the light to the celery and it just kind of gets smothered out. And one last final mistake I see way too many gardeners making is wanting to use heat mats. Now, heat mats are not inherently bad and they do serve a purpose, but for a really select few crops, for a select length of time. A lot of people, they'll just put all their plants on a heat mat. It's a big mistake because, number one, not all plants need a heat mat. Things like broccoli, cabbage, your brassicas, lettuce, things like that, they don't want to be put on a heat mat. They will actually be super stressed if you put them on a heat mat, and that's because they like soil that's cool. Yes, the seeds will germinate faster, but from the moment those seeds germinate, they'll say, "Get me out of here," and they'll start getting really leggy and very stressed because the soil is just too warm. Now, with things like peppers and tomatoes, yeah, heat mats are great, but only for a certain length of time. And that's the second part, is that sometimes people leave them on the whole time. And a heat mat should only be used until you see the seeds emerge the soil. Once you start to see the seeds emerge, take the heat mat off and turn it off. And that's because heat mats just get too warm. And even for something like peppers and tomatoes that like warm soil, 85, 90 degrees is too warm. It's too warm for a seedling, and it's going to cause excess evaporation. The soil is going to dry out very quickly. It also is going to cause the soil to just heat up, and the plant really does not grow at its best when the soil is super warm. The most ideal temperature is 60 to 65 degrees, which is like ambient temperature. So yes, the seeds will germinate faster, but once the seeds do germinate, take them off the heat mat, they're going to appreciate it. And that's about it. I got a few more seeds left to germinate, or I guess a few more seeds left to start here, and then we'll be off to the races. But oh, one more mistake that I see a lot of gardeners making, and this is a big one, and this is, it's a little controversial because it does help, like a lot like a heat mat, and that's a humidity dome. Now, there's nothing wrong with a humidity dome, just like there's nothing wrong with a heat mat. It's just the length of time that you leave it on. You see, humidity is a good thing for seeds to germinate. They like it. It also means you're going to be watering less, and that means that there's more water contained to where the seeds, to where the seeds are, and that's going to help germination. But if you leave them on too long, if you leave a humidity dome on too long, what happens is humidity leads to mold and mildew. And you don't want to have mold and mildew on your plants, especially seedlings. That's what leads to damping off. And damping off is basically where the plant grows up and then just wilts and falls over at the stem. It's also a sign of overwatering as well. But humidity is a huge cause of that. And that's because things like mold spores and mildews and even bacteria, they love really humid, warm environments. And that's also another reason why a heat mat plus a humidity dome, which I see people do far too frequently, is just a terrible, terrible thing to do, and you will so often end up with issues. And so when starting seeds, the best thing to do is just to put them in a warm room, keep them watered well from below, and you're going to be great. So that's about all I got for you today. I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you learned something new. If you did, make sure to let me know in the comments box below what you learned. And again, if you made some mistakes, that's totally fine. That's part of the fun about gardening is, seeds are pretty inexpensive. You got lots of time. Just simply restart. Get yourself off to a good start, and you'll be doing great. So I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you learned something new. And as always, this is Luke from the MIgardener channel, reminding you to grow big or go home. And we'll catch you all later. See ya. Bye, guys.